We finally have pretty much everything we need to get this Fireblade motorbike engine mounted into our truck. So welcome back to K & Build, and as you would already know by the thumbnail and title of this video, we're finally getting to mount our Honda Fireblade motorbike engine into our K truck. We've had this engine for a little while, we've been going back and forth, different ideas, but we've got the exact idea we want now. There's a couple of things we have to buy before we can mount it in, as buying these components depends on where we sit the engine. So they'll be coming in the next couple of days, hopefully. But first thing I've got to do, we are moving the engine further back towards the cab. And let me show you why we're doing that. Also, this might look new to some people, but in the last video on the K truck, we made this. This is essentially our boot build. Obviously, we don't have a boot on the truck, so this is where all of our air setup is going to sit. We've previously toyed with the idea of putting a chain, basically mounting that engine the other way and then running a chain and having some sort of diff for that. Hence why we have never removed this front support here, because if the engine could be mounted quite close to the back, then that would mean we wouldn't have to remove this support. We've also removed a support very similar to these two here, which was currently in the middle. We are going to brace it back up at the end with some sort of tube frame, so we are going to reinforce it. But we then decided to go down the idea of having the actual MX-5 diff. One, because parts will be a lot easier to get a hold of, and everything on the rear end then from diff backwards, all of the suspension arms, the suspension, everything like that is from an MX-5, and the parts are really easy to get hold of. However, deciding to use a diff means that we're going to have a prop. So we are waiting on the adapter. There's an adapter which goes under the sprocket there, which essentially creates a similar mating surface to what's on the diff. So what we end up with then is two surfaces, both ends, and we have to find a prop to go in between. However, this isn't very far apart at all, and the other issue is the angle at which the diff and the sprocket is currently sitting at. So as you can see here, the sprocket on the engine is quite high and the diff is quite low. And that would mean our prop shaft, if we can find one short enough or if we have to have one custom made, will be sat at quite a severe angle. So we have decided to move this engine forward. But in order to move it forward, that would mean we have to remove this brace. So easy enough to do, but just like that, we have a lot more space to mount this engine. We will obviously end up redoing these pieces here and plating them. As you can see, we've added one here, which is where one of the braces was previously. My welding is getting a lot better, so hopefully that should be easier. But just to show you from the side now, the previous mounting point there, and the engine was roughly here, so the angle was a lot more severe. However, being further back now to the right, you can see the angle of the prop should be a lot less severe than previously. So after several weeks of ordering parts, waiting for things to come, measuring things, checking a few things here and there, we finally have pretty much everything we need to get this Fireblade motorbike engine mounted into our truck. These are all of the parts we have. Obviously we have tube steel. We've gone for 38mm by 2.6mm thickness. This is just a length I've used for measuring in here, but we have 6 meters of that. We have 5mm plate, which I'm going to use to make a lot of brackets and spacers. This isn't going to be welded to the chassis. I want to make everything bolt on, bolt off, so we're going to be using some nice hefty 5mm plates as our bases and stuff like that. We also then have the new prop shaft. As you can see, this is from a BMW X3, and then we also have a sprocket adapter. So what that does is change the sprocket from a cog, which would normally have a chain on the engine, and converts it to a flat surface like you would have on a flat diff with 4 bolt holes. But in order to get this prop shaft fitted to our bike engine with the adapter and to the MX-5 rear diff, we've had to make some adapters. So these are currently 3D printed. These will be made in metal later down the line, but for now we've got some adapters ready to mount this prop shaft. So first thing for us to do is get this prop shaft mounted to the diff and the bike, so we need to know how far forward or back this engine is going to live. We don't really have much adjustability with the prop shaft. We may be able to get thinner or wider adapters because we're going to get them laser cut out of metal, so we can go 10, 15, 20mm in metal, but that's the only adjustment we have. Without further ado, let's build this prop shaft and finally get it mounted to the truck. This end uses M8 countersunk bolts which go and thread directly into the adapter. I also have only got 2 bolts for now, so I need to get 2 more to add into there, but for the sake of mocking the engine up, this will do. As you can see, they simply come through the adapter there. We'll add some Loctite when we come to do it eventually, and I need 2 more. But this needs to now go on the bike, as there is a bolt which goes in there, but if we bolt this on now, we don't have access to the bolt in the middle. So this goes on there, and then this gets bolted to the adapter once it's on the bike. So onto the other end, where we have the diff, we also have to put this adapter into place. However, in order to bolt this to the adapter, if we had a standard bolt in the adapter, there would simply be a head of a bolt there, and that would mean that the diff is not going to sit flush. Hence why we've done all these countersunk bolts. So all this side does now is use some countersunk bolts which go into there, go through the prop, and then bolt 4 all the way around. So let me get that done. So now that they're bolted together, just to show you, so this surface now will mount to the diff, which, as I said earlier, is basically this plate here, and by having the countersunk holes, it is now perfectly flush, ready to go to the diff. This piece goes onto the bike. Need 2 more bolts, but this is also now ready to use the 4 outer bolts to mount onto this end of the prop. All we need to do now is get this mounted to the bike engine, this end mounted to the diff, and then these 2 bolted together once it's in place, and then you'll see how it looks. So for the adapter, all it does is slides onto the what used to be where the sprocket was before, and a simple bolt which goes onto the end of the spline to hold the adapter into place. So what we can do now is mount the rear end onto the diff. So all that has to do is be placed up against. If I move the engine forward, I can place the bolts through the diff. As you can see, they bolt up nicely, and all we got to do now is add some nuts onto the back. We do need to do a bit of finishing, add some washers and things like that, but for the time being, to mount this engine all into place, this is all we need to do. And now for the front, basically the same applies, but now we mount the prop to the adapter. So pull the engine onto the prop. Once this is all lined up, we just put some bolts. These are the same, we need to get the right sizes. These are a little bit long, but what you may see there now is the reason we notched off the bike adapter, as if that notch wasn't there, it would be obstructing the bolt. So now we can add a nut and a washer to the end of that to locate it into place. But that is the prop shaft mounted. So now that the prop is fully bolted in, that's finally give us our position of where the engine is going to sit forwards and backwards. So this is pretty much exactly where the engine is going to sit. As you can see, the prop shaft is slightly offset, but based on what we was looking at in previous episodes, this is really straight. This is pretty good, and the angle at which it tilts up is also pretty good as well. So we're pretty happy with where this is sitting right now. So what we can start to do now is finally get this thing mounted in using our tube frame. So the idea we have is to essentially add 2 bars, because we do have to reinforce these chassis rails in some way or another, but it would be to add a bar going from here across to there, and the other side of the engine across from there to there. And what we will then do then is mount the bracket there to the bar, this one to the bar, and the same on the other side. And then we'll also create a piece for the one at the bottom separately, which will mount onto the chassis rail alone. I appreciate this looks a little bit ugly at the minute, but this is to give a visual representation of what we're trying to achieve. So what we'll end up with is 2 of these bars here, and what we can now do then is essentially add the piece on which I previously mentioned, which will get bolted onto there, and then we can add a piece which goes from this section up to the bar. And the same there, all we'll have to do is create a bracket off this tube here to join onto there. But what I may do as well is add a bracket which joins this one and this one together, and then join them all onto one piece. This side we only have one, so all we'll have to do is create a piece to go from here up to the metal bar. Unfortunately, I don't have any sort of metal benders or anything like that, so I can't really make any cool bends and stuff. I may look again one in the future, seeing what we can do, but this is fairly straightforward. With what we have, this is the best we can possibly do, and try and make it look as show-worthy as possible. I also forgot to mention the 5mm plate that we have here. We're going to be using that to create some brackets which will come off each of the 4 posts of the frame, and then we're going to basically bolt through the chassis, either go inside the chassis rail or add a long bolt like this and go straight through the chassis rail. And what I will do then is reinforce the inside of the rails, add some big washers. These washers are obviously too small. We'd add big square washers for spreading the load onto the chassis rail, but we're undecided yet how we're going to do that as well. But first thing I'm going to attack is getting this bar into place and coming up with a system to mount these 2 engine points, and that will be our first engine point mounted to the chassis. So So as you can see there now, this piece is replaced. Again, it's just pressed into the frames there, squeezed into place. But what I have done is made some pieces which I'm going to use to mount from there to the two mounts which go onto there. So I have this piece here. This is going to bolt directly to the engine. Well, there's going to be a rubber between this and the engine to reduce any vibration. But this is what's going to bolt directly onto the engine. And what I've done then is created these. So these are essentially going to slide down the tube. We'll put them into position and they'll be welded around the length of the tube. Either just stitch welded or we may fully weld them. Not really sure yet, as all it needs to do is stop this rotating, as this isn't going to pull through the metal. And then this flat section here will mount directly to the piece I just showed you, which mounts to the bike engine. It took a bit of time, so I've done all this off camera, trial and error, trying to get things to work. But let's just get it on and see how it looks. So I have the first piece kind of lined up. I've took a lot of measurements and I'm pretty sure where it is perfectly where it needs to be. So as you can see, we're perfectly level on this bar here. I have leveled the bed previously, so the bed is pretty much level. And I have taken measurements from that post to the firewall and the same there, taken loads of measurements, and they're basically within a mil of each other. It's never going to be perfect. That back wall might be a bit off, and it does look pretty square. All of my brackets are sitting nice and square. As for the bracket, what you can see there now is it bolts to there. I've added some washers, as we will be adding rubber, so that kind of accounts for that. And there is a bolt in underneath, so the bracket essentially comes down, across, up and there. And what I'm going to do now, using these two pieces here, get these perfectly lined up with the bracket. Going to add some tack welds. I need to clean up the cross member here. It's not bolted in there yet, as I want to make brackets to mount this end to the chassis rail somehow. But for the time being, what I'm going to do now is get this kind of squared up, tacked into place. So after taking the piece in and out of the truck a couple of times, I had to take it in and out so I could get this piece fully welded and grinded down, because once the bar goes through the middle of there, I'm not going to be able to get down into the inside of there. It's not the best of welds on the inside, as it's quite awkward to get into, but on the outside, my welding is getting much better. I just like to point out, I'm no professional welder. I've only been welding for a couple of months on this truck. But that should do the job nicely. So all I've got to do now, bolt this onto the engine with the bar going through the middle, take a load of measurements again, get my bar in the right orientation that I want it, and then all I got to do is tack on the, I think I might tack all on the inside of this piece, because it'll be nice to keep the outsides nice and smooth, and then we just run a weld on the inside. All this is stopping it from doing is stops any rotation. Obviously the actual bracket itself stops any movement up and down, so the welds on the bar itself, all they do is just stop any sort of rotation on the engine, which there isn't a lot of force on that anyway. So let's get this back in, bar back in, and start tacking the bar finally into place onto the engine. And just like that, that is the one cross member done. Bracket is all tacked on and bolted to the engine. So all we have to do now is basically make a mount off that piece there up and create the two end plates. But that is all I'm going to cover in today's video. It's been a pretty productive video and pretty successful. We now have the prop shaft, which we was trying to find for a couple of weeks. As again, I don't know if I mentioned much before, but this is an X3 prop shaft. What we didn't mention was, yes, we could have modified the flange on the diff and we could have modified the adapter, but we want to make everything as off the shelf as possible. If we end up for some reason at a track day one day and our diff goes, then that means all we have to do is find a diff, and we haven't got to do any drilling or modification to the diff, as it will fit perfectly on. We'll probably get spare adapters made when it comes to it, just for that reason. The only modification we have to do is obviously to that adapter, which takes probably 10 minutes. But that shouldn't be a breaking point, as that is probably one of the strongest points of the prop shaft. And we've also got everything perfectly lined up. I know that the engine is perfectly parallel with the chassis rails, taking all sorts of measurements, and I now know that this is also parallel with the back of the cab, so that there is perfectly parallel and perfectly aligned. I've marked everything up so that if I come back to it, all I've got to do is put this back on. I'm not going to remove this for the time being, as what I would like to do is start to make a look at mounting these sides and this side, but that will be in the next K-Truck video. If you see anything we're doing you think we could improve on, it may be a bit overkill as to what we've done so far, but this truck had 30 odd horsepower from factory, and I think the Fireblade has something like 140, 150 horsepower. We've lost a lot of weight, so if we can reinforce it as much as possible, then we will. We have got a lot more reinforcing to do, but in the next K-Truck video, hopefully this engine will be mounted and will be suspended in the air. We can remove the piece from underneath the truck and hopefully it's held up with its own weight. As I said, more bracing will come later down the line, so when we complete it in the next video, that won't be the completely finished product. That is just allowing us to get this engine mounted exactly where we want it, so we can start to look at things like the radiators and all things like that, because we can reinforce everything again. We're going to have to add some more reinforcement back here, so that will be later down the line. So make sure you go and drop subscribe to see everything that's going to happen with this. We've still got to mount fuel tanks, coolant tanks, radiators, everything like that yet, so we've still got plenty to do. We hope you've enjoyed the video. We have loads to do on this truck, and we will catch you in the next one.